Let's go to Rob now. Let's work out exactly where Alfred is and what's the stats, Rob?
Yeah, so this system is just between Moreton Island and northern Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. It's kind of on the cusp there. You can see it on the radar quite clearly. That circulation spinning around. It crossed North Stradbroke Island and Moreton Island around midnight last night, and now it has moved very slowly. It's pretty much stalled, very slowly edging northwards. We're expecting it to make the westward turn overland, but I can't see any evidence of it doing that at the moment. So it's very slow moving between Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast, essentially just out to sea. And you can see the rain totals. They have been going up very quickly. We've seen totals as high as 240 millimetres in the Gold Coast Hinterland at Upper Springbrook. Lismore is now up to 130 millimetres since 9 o'clock yesterday. Gold Coast itself on 112 millimetres. And Brisbane is starting to see the heavier rainfall moving in. So you can see those main bands of the southern edge of the cyclone moving across Moreton Island and Stradbroke Island and starting to impact on Brisbane, aiding it to get to 40 millimetres. But southeastern parts of Brisbane are now up to almost 100 millimetres. So those totals are starting to climb. The heavy falls that we have been seeing further south are edging northwards. Now to the wind. These are the strongest gusts we saw yesterday at the weather stations. Quite a few places, as you can see, reaching 90 to 120 kilometres per hour. Early this morning, we've gusted again at Byron to 111 kilometres an hour. It's been quite blustery at the Gold Coast and in parts of Brisbane, but as you can see at the main weather station in the city, only gusts to 48 kilometres an hour early this morning. So that's why Josh wasn't woken up by the howling wind last night, because it wasn't all that windy for Brisbane itself. But as you can see, we've seen significant impacts on the coast over the last few days with huge waves pounding the coastline. And this morning, I haven't got all of the data that I would like to see, but I believe there's been a storm surge as well on parts of the Gold Coast. So we have to wait and see on the data on that one and from people on the ground, because to be honest, there's not that much data about the areas where I think the worst storm surge has occurred. There's only one observation site for the tide gauges at the Gold Coast, and it's still yet to report the high tide for this morning because it's a little ways up the canals, and it looks like we're going to have it higher than the highest astronomical tide for the year. So unfortunately, it seems like some homes may have been flooded over the last hour or two on the Gold Coast and maybe up around Stradbroke Island and Moreton Island as well, potentially, whilst thankfully in Brisbane we haven't seen that in Redland Bay. So that is some good news there for Redland Bay and for Brisbane itself, because there were fears around that region. But you can see the cyclone warning is now from Brisbane to Noosa, so it's been cancelled south of Brisbane, so that's some good news. The threat of winds is easing, but we've still got that threat for the next little while for damaging wind gusts, and of course we've still got the threat for a lot more rainfall. It's just begun for Brisbane. As the system is making landfall, it's likely to be going back to being a low pressure system rather than a tropical cyclone. But as it does that, the heaviest rain will arrive for Brisbane. You can see that here, that black shading. We're expecting these main bands of the cyclone to drill in that rainfall, and that's when we'll potentially see these really nasty rain totals. So anywhere in that yellow shaded area at risk of heavy rainfall, with totals up to 250 millimetres in 6 hours and up to 450 in the next 24 hours. So this is definitely not over yet. The worst impacts in my mind for this system are going to be the rainfall, and that's still got a long way to go, Pete, with major flood warnings in a number of spots, including in Lismore. We're expecting it to reach the major level later this morning.
Rob, that's a really good comprehensive wrap. Just on that, when you said the worst of it is going to be the rainfall, probably more so than the winds, cyclone category 1, gusts are about 100 k's an hour. So where do you expect the worst of it to be when it comes to the rainfall?
I think from now on, the worst of the rainfall is probably going to be these areas around Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and maybe up to the Sunshine Coast if this system edges north. But then the rain will drift further westward. So Toowoomba, your Stanthorpes, maybe Lismore could still see a fair bit more rain out of this. But I think the southern end of this warning area is less of a risk than it was in the previous days.
And look, Alfred's been hard to predict, as we've known the last couple of days. Any idea of when it might hit the mainland at this stage?
Anytime in the next few hours, it's still just very slow moving at the top end of Moreton Bay.